Isn't it easy to stay in touch these days? You know, we've never had more technology or more apps to allow us to communicate with people on the far side of the planet even. We've got smartphones, email, social media. We've got any number of messaging apps. WhatsApp alone is bad enough, isn't it? Trying to keep on top of WhatsApp, let alone your Messenger, and if you've got Instagram, Telegram, all the other grams. We've got all these ways of staying in touch. So why are so many people so lonely? You would think, wouldn't you, that loneliness would be easier than ever to banish. Here's some statistics for you. I told you this morning I wasn't a big fan of maths, but we've got some statistics tonight. In 2022, nearly 50% of adults in the UK, that's just shy of 26 million people, they said they felt lonely occasionally, sometimes, often, or always. For 7.1%, that's 3.83 million people, this loneliness was chronic. That meant that they felt it often or always. That is a number that had risen since 2020. Loneliness is an invisible plague impacting our society, and one in different ways. You know, despite how busy we are and how many people we deal with, it's one that I think at times we all suffer from. So isn't it good that God reveals himself in his word as Yahweh Shammah? That means the Lord is there. We're going to look at the threefold reality of that. Well, firstly, the Lord is there is a future reality. A future reality. Now, it might seem strange to start in the future, but both of the passages that we read before teach us as much, don't they? Both the end of Ezekiel and the end of Revelation teach that there will be a future time when God's people will live with God. And yet we could talk about how in many ways that is fulfilled in the church age, but it does seem the kingdom is here, but it's not here yet. There is something yet to be fulfilled. There is something future. A future time when God and his people will live together in a glorious city. That's a symbol of permanent habitation and security. That's the curious thing about the name Yahweh Shammah, is that properly speaking, it's the name given to the city, isn't it? If you were to turn to Ezekiel, it's the name on the city. The name of the city from that time on will be the Lord is there. So I wasn't sure if I should do this in a series about the names of God, but it is a name of God and it's a truth of God, even though it's given to the city. The Lord is there. This city that describes the reality of the future state, being with the Lord, being in his presence. It summarizes what differentiates this city from every other place that humans have lived and existed throughout history. You know, we could compare this city in Ezekiel to Babylon in Revelation 17. Unlike all those other cities, unlike Babel, unlike Babylon, unlike New York or London or wherever, unlike all of them, the Lord is there in this city. Now, coming at the end of Ezekiel's prophecy, this gains a powerful significance. Like I was saying, the chief thrust of Ezekiel's message is to call Israel out on their faithfulness and idolatry. This is what had led to the initial deportation to Babylon and would lead to the final fall of Jerusalem that Ezekiel prophesies about. Maybe remember, he sort of makes a model of the city and knocks through the walls and he holds a pan over it and does all those kind of things to show what's going to happen, the final fall of Jerusalem. And God's people had abandoned or neglected the right worship of God. They were still going to the temple and doing stuff, but, they were worshipping other gods as well in secret or in public, turning their back on the altar to worship the sun. And so they suffered a broken relationship with God as a result. You read chapter 10 of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel describes the glory of God departing from Jerusalem. It's heartbreaking as he hands her over to her sins and her enemies. And it's like he's saying, all your worst fears will come true. So to finish this at times very dark prophecy with this promise is incredible. It promises not a city that's surrounded by enemies, not a city where there's no food, not a city where people are reduced to cannibalism or cooking their meagre rations over dung, but a perfect city, a perfect land, an enduring and eternal situation of hope, joy, and belonging, a situation where God will put his name on the city and never leave her again. The glory will not depart from this city. Now, don't we yearn for the same thing that the exiles did in Babylon? Exiled from Eden, cast out of the meeting place of heaven and earth, unable to come into the living presence of the God we've rebelled against, suffering in the wilderness. And yet we can read throughout the Bible, it's not just in Ezekiel and Revelation, of the promise to people of all nations. It's not only Israel, is it? That's what we saw this morning. It's all nations, of a future city, a future home where God is. Like Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, you may be also. A future home where God is. Isn't that something to look forward to? Won't that hope, that reality, keep us going when otherwise we might give up? I know some of you have been teachers, and the end of term is very hard work, isn't it? How do you keep going? Because you know a break is coming up. It's the reality of that half term or that summer holidays or whatever it is that can keep you going when you're tired, when you're weary, when you can't put up with those kids anymore. The future reality keeps us going. The Lord is there. Well, secondly, we know we can rely on this promise about the future because of how God has proven his presence in the past. That gets a bit confusing. We talk about present and past and future, but the Lord is there is a past reality. A past reality. When you start looking at the Old Testament, and even just confining yourself to the Old Testament, because you could go into the New, but let's stick to the Old Testament for a bit. And you list all the times that God proves himself or declares himself or is really obviously present. This sermon will be a lot longer if I started listing them all, and I'd probably miss some. But let's think of a few examples just to underline this. We see it really clearly, don't we, in the Exodus? God lives with Israel in the desert. He's living with them. He's right there in the heart of the camp. His ongoing presence with them is what the law given at Sinai is meant to secure. A holy people whose purification permits a holy God to continue to live with them. How can they live with God in the heart of them without being destroyed? Well, God gives them away. Here's a sacrificial system. Impurity can be dealt with. We can put it away. And God's presence in the camp isn't just decorative. If you read Exodus 13, it says, "By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way. and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Now, that's really interesting when you see in Revelation 20, 21 and 22 that we don't need it, or 22, that you don't need any light because God and the Lamb give them light. Well, what does that make us think of? Well, it's Exodus, isn't it? The pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. He was present, and God was really present. He was visibly present. You know, if you had walked in that pillar of fire, you would have been burnt up. He was there to lead and illumine and even protect his people. Just in the next chapter of Exodus, in chapter 14, when Pharaoh's army comes after them, when Pharaoh's like, what are we doing? We've let the Israelites plunder us. This is no good. We're Egypt. We're Babel the Great. We shouldn't allow them to go off with all our gold and silver. So they go after them to kill them all. And God puts himself between his people and their enemies. It's like a mother getting in the way of her child and a rabid dog. He interposes himself. The angel of God, who'd been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Now, you see the same thing after Moses dies and Joshua takes over command. And you hear his reassurance to the people as they're preparing to enter the land and face the enemies that had seemed so terrifying just 40 years before. So terrifying that when the spies reported back, apart from Joshua and Caleb, they said, there's no chance. They're too powerful. They've got walled cities. We can't take these cities. And yet Joshua says, Joshua 1:9, be strong and courageous for what? For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. When they're entering the land, crossing the Jordan, the ark goes first, doesn't it? The ark has to go first because they need to know we can only do this if God goes first. If he drives out the enemies. The presence of God is how they conquered walled cities and giants. Now, you go back even earlier in the Bible. We've not got much Bible to go back earlier in from Joshua, but you go back earlier. Before the people were even a people at all. Because maybe you think, God might be with his people, but what if I'm not Jewish? Will he be there for individuals, or is he only bothered about nations? Egypt's and Israel's and Assyria's and all the big nations. Does he not care about individuals? He just cares about the big picture. But if you were to turn to Genesis 28, you would meet Jacob, gets later called Israel. He's fleeing on his own from his murderous brother, and his brother's kind of got reason to be angry as well. And Jacob has nothing but the clothes on his back. And in the night, he has a vision of a ladder into heaven, and he declares, surely the Lord is in this place. And I was not aware of it. So to one lonely and slightly dodgy man, God was present with power and reassured this one man of a great and secure future. I'm thinking about prayer. I couldn't neglect to mention Jonah, could I? Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. Now, we could talk about Tarshish if we had more time. In fact, I might do anyway, because you're all too polite to stop me. We were talking this morning about sort of the first century Jewish view of the world and how they thought there were 70 nations, 70 languages. Thinking about the 70 nations listed in the roll in Genesis 10, the table of nations. Tarshish, I don't think is mentioned, but they think it's one of them in there. In the first century, they saw Tarshish as being basically the last place on earth. Probably Spain, we think maybe a Phoenician settlement on the east coast of Spain, or south perhaps. And to a Jewish person, it was just the other side of the world. It was the end of the world. It was the last place on the map. And so it's the last place we expect once the gospel come here, the end's going to come. So when Paul goes to Spain, he's probably thinking, right, the gospel's come to all the nations, I've got to go to Spain, and then Jesus is going to come back. Because Paul didn't know quite how big the world was. But in his mind, Tarshish, Spain, the end of the world. So Jonah ran away from the Lord, and headed for Tarshish. He was going to the last place he thought God was going to turn up. He tries to escape. He doesn't want to preach to God's enemies. He doesn't want to preach in Nineveh. He doesn't want to preach to the Assyrians, because he knows what God's like. And he knows that if they repent, then God will show mercy. And Jonah doesn't want God to show mercy to the Assyrians. He wants God to show judgment. But whether it's in a boat in the middle of the sea, which is a terrifying place for any Israelite, because they were not an ocean-going people, or if it's at the bottom of that same sea in the belly of a great fish, or whether it's in Nineveh, the heart of the enemy empire. This is like Jonah walking into the middle of the Death Star. This is Jonah on Coruscant, and that's a reference that maybe very few people understand. I shouldn't have made it, but we'll move on. He goes into the heart of the enemy empire. This is where the false gods have their greatest power. I think, was it Dagon was the chief of the Assyrian gods. And yet Jonah found, whether he was in any of those places, that God was there with him, hearing his voice, hearing his cry for mercy, protecting him, steering him, engaging with him, no matter how stubborn or nasty Jonah got. Do you do right to be angry, Jonah? The Lord is there, a past reality. And that's all very well for plaster saints, isn't it? It's good to know that God offers to be with us in the life to come. And it's nice to hear about how he was there for saints of old. But what about now? Because that's what we're really bothered about, isn't it? Not what might be a very distant future, not the stories of very distant past, no matter how factual they are. We're bothered about the life we live now and the problems that we face now. That's what frightens us, isn't it? Most people don't lose sleep thinking about the heat death of the universe, or thinking about the risk of Viking raiders or the Black Death. But we do worry about getting our results back from the doctors. We worry about our kids and grandkids. We worry about whether we'll be able to pay the bills this time next year, or even this time next month. So we need to know that what will be true in the future, that what was true in the past, is a present reality. And on a philosophical level, maybe you understand this, God, I think most of us know, don't we? He's omnipresent. That means he is present in all places. As the psalmist wrote in Psalm 139, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. Wherever you go, you will find God there. But hearing the words of that psalm, does that sound to you like a purely theoretical or a purely philosophical kind of knowledge? It's not just a head knowledge that the psalmist has, is it? This is a personal and experiential knowledge of the living and active presence of God. So it's not just, Lord, I know that you are present. If I walk into a different room, even though I can't see you, I know you are there because you are present in all places. He says, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. Wherever he is, whatever situation, however dark, however much it might be the result of his own folly, like it was for Jonah, God will be present. And that is not a factual or a dead presence. It is a present reality. God acts, God keeps, God guards, God guides. God is conscious of, interested in, and favourably disposed towards. There's a promise, you'll know this, I'm sure, that Moses, speaking on God's behalf, makes to Israel as they're ready to enter the promised land without. Could you imagine being Israel? Being part of the nation of Israel, and you've been wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, and your parents' generation have all died off. All the adults who came out of Egypt, apart from Caleb and Joshua, and Moses, because he's about to die, they've all died off. And you, having known nothing basically in your adult memory, apart from wandering around in the wilderness, with probably a fairly meagre diet. You know, you've not eaten that much other than manna, have you? You've eaten plenty of manna and the odd bit of meat. And then you're going into this alien land full of actual giants and probably just very tall people because they're living off a better diet than you are. And you'd be terrified, wouldn't you? And you think, well, Moses, he's our direct line to God. And he's not coming with us. How are we going to face that? He's the one who stands in the breach. He's the one who, when we mess up, he goes to God and smooths it all out. And so Moses says to them, the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. That's Deuteronomy 31 verse 6. And that promise applied to the Old Covenant people in Deuteronomy is picked up in the New Testament, and it's applied to the New Covenant people, the church. The author of the Hebrews writes, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. That's not the author saying, I will never leave you or forsake you. That's the author saying, God says, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And he's writing in a bit that's about being content with what we have, not being consumed with a love of money. So you don't need to worry about those things because God has promised to be with you. So whatever the future threatens, whatever we seem to lack, God is with his people. He's there not only because he's omnipresent, but he's there providing for us, caring for us, reaching out to us. He's present with his people. And it's the difference, isn't it? The difference between just thinking about a God who's omnipresent, because, you know, you can have a kind of philosophical God who is present in all places, but you don't really think of him being a personal God, engaged with those places where he is. So it's a bit like trying to get our heads over how God is present, that it is omnipresent, but it's more than that. It's the difference between sitting in a waiting room with a stranger reading a book who doesn't look at you or speak to you, and sitting at the meal table with your parents who talk to you, who put food on your plate, who make you laugh, who comfort you when you cry. It's a categorical difference, isn't it? Whatever our fears, whatever our worries, whatever the darkness that seems to hide us and blind us, he's there in the dark with us, holding our hand, and his voice of reassurance speaks out of the darkness. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. We are never alone. God isn't just in the room with us. We are the temple where he lives. The Lord is there, a present reality. Because past, present, and future all find an answer and a redeeming hope in Yahweh Shammah. The Lord is there. Because the future reality is certain and it is glorious. We will have a home with God where he is forever. And that is a reality with which we can face down our fears. We might not know quite how we'll get there, but we know where the story ends. The past reality not only gives us proven certainty to trust in the hope of the future, but it lets us face down our doubts. Maybe we wonder if God was there in some terrible thing we went through. We wonder if God abandoned us after some foolish mistake. Did he just nod off for that bit of our life? But God has proven to his people, for all their weakness and all their foolishness, that his faithful love is stronger and he has never abandoned them. Even in the darkest times, God was there working all things for their good. The present reality, our daily worries, our loneliness through the long watches of the night, the ache of not being fully known or loved or accepted as we are, of not having the time to have deep, meaningful, intimate friendships. We can face down the void of emptiness, knowing that there is no moment, waking or sleeping, when God is not with his people, where God is not concerned about how you are. Closer than your own skin. He is there with you, living with you, helping you. As Jesus said, I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Know your God. Yahweh Shammah, the Lord is there. Let's sing to close.